Back Look Cinema, the podcast.
Little ducks, there's trouble in Russia. So they called us. And we're going over there and bringing the most lethal killing machine ever devised. We're capable of launching more firepower that has ever been released in the history of war. One purpose alone: keep our country safe. We constitute the front line and the last line of defense. I expect and demand your very best. Anything less, you should have joined the Air Force. This might be our Commander-in-Chief's Navy, but this is my boat. And all I ask is that you keep up with me. And if you can't, that strange sensation you'll be feeling at the seat of your pants will be my boot in your ass. Hello, my name is Zoe. It's spelled Z-O or Z-O for those of you outside of the U.S. Welcome back. This is the 175th episode of Back Look Cinema, the podcast, where we take a look back at the movies of yesteryear, especially the movies of the latter half of the last millennium. Now, if you like what you're about to hear, then please tell your family, tell your friends, and tell those extremely dapper, styled to the nines in their dressed white uniforms and extraordinarily professional U.S. naval officers about Back Look Cinema. Now, in the movie that we are going to discuss at this present time, I remember watching this in a theater, and I remember watching it subsequently at home on, I don't know if it was cable or maybe I had the DVD or whatever, but it is a movie that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm sure that you've enjoyed this movie also. And that movie is Crimson Tide. Now, there were a couple of questions I had, a couple of plot points that I wanted to explore. That I'll get into as we talk about the movie. It's like, is this really plausible? Is this part of actual Navy regulations? But later I got in my research, I was able to get clarification on that. And there were some other things that I was trying to explore when I did my cursory, and I do mean very light research on this movie. So what's interesting is that because of the plot points, this movie did not get all the support from the U.S. Navy, and the production company had to reach out to the French to help make this movie, because when they initially approached the Navy to get their cooperation, you know, the Navy was very receptive, and either in the original plot of the movie or maybe it was a plot point that they were selling the Navy. I'm not exactly clear on that. But as far as the Navy was concerned, what they were told is that this plot would involve a nuclear submarine it was a Trident nuclear submarine that had an advanced computer system that the crew was going to try to stop because the computer system had gone rogue and it was going to launch some nuclear weapons. It was being pitched as The Hunt for the Red October meets 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the crew basically had to stop the computer from launching all these nuclear weapons. I guess you can add mixed with war games, because we covered the movie War Games a few episodes ago, and that was basically what that about. The computer system goes rogue and is threatening to launch nuclear weapons. Now, the Navy had brought them aboard one of their submarines, and when I mean them, I mean the president of I think it was the president of Hollywood Pictures, and his name was Ricardo Maestres, director Tony Scott, the producers Simpson and Beikheimer, and screenwriters Michael Schiffer and Richard Henrick, and you know, they were all aboard. And basically the XO of that ship, I think it was the USS Florida, Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander William Toty, basically took him on the tour. He basically went through all the motions of the things that Denzel Washington would later use in Crimson Tide. And basically kind of impressing upon the writers and producers that it's really implausible for the computer to go rogue and start launching nuclear weapons. It's not something that's going to happen on a U.S. naval ship. And this probably inspired rewrites. And what the writers and producers decided on, that this is going to be a mutiny where, the sub is set to launch nuclear weapons, and then there's a mutiny to try to stop the launch or something along that lines. And at that point, that's when the Navy withdrew their cooperation, because they don't want to suggest or support in any way, shape, or form that there could ever be a mutiny in U.S. military. So they decided not to cooperate. And so they Tony Scott, that is, engaged in some rogue filmmaking in order to get some of the shots that we see in this movie, as well as cooperation with the French government. And then, I'll get into some of that later on, I think. The only thing that, really is, and you kind of see it in the beginning of the film, is where there's a reporter and he's reporting atop a French aircraft carrier. And I think it's the USS Foch. And then there were some other things, like they borrowed a sub from the French government or whatever in order to shoot the movie, because the US Navy was like, they're hands off this project. But in spite of not having cooperation from the US Navy, this film seems remarkably accurate. It seems like it feels authentic. I'll put it that way. Cause I've been in the military. I've been in the U.S. Army, but I don't have any idea, how the U.S. Navy, protocols and how that's run or anything like that. I can only make assumptions based on my own experience in a completely different branch of the military. But that being said, looking at it, like obviously somebody who's actually been in the Navy, who's actually served in the submarine, would have different feelings and thoughts. They would be better able to identify, what's authentic and what's inauthentic in this movie better than I can. But to me, it looks plausible. A lot of the stuff looks incredible. And, it's that, I think that keeps the film grounded, and that's one of the things that I liked about this particular movie. But I've been going on and on about a little bit about my experience with the movie and watching it years ago. It's been a long time since I've seen this movie, and I was glad to revisit it. So let's get into the opening credits and talk about Crimson Tide from 1995. Lieutenant Commander Ron Hunter was assigned to the nuclear missile submarine USS Alabama during a time of extreme tension between Russia, Russian rebels, and the U.S. There he served as the second in command to Captain Frank Ramsey, a notorious hard-ass. Their mission was to patrol the seas near Russia and, if necessary, launch their nuclear payload to disrupt the Russian nuclear missiles that had been captured by the Russian rebels and possibly start a nuclear holocaust. There was ongoing tension between Hunter and his captain, but things were really ramped up when first they got a confirmed message to launch their nuclear missiles, and later a second interrupted message regarding the nuclear launch. Captain Ramsey wants to continue as planned, but his XO, Hunter, wants to confirm the message to see if they actually need to launch their missiles or if that message or that mission had been canceled. This disagreement led to a mutiny and a divided crew and a near destruction of the USS Alabama. Crimson Tide was released May 12, 1995, produced by Hollywood Pictures and Don Simpson / Jerry Bruckheimer Films. It grossed over $91 million in the US and Canada and over $157 million worldwide on a reported budget of $53 million. And if we translate that to today's dollars, that's the $91 million that it grossed in the US and Canada. That would be like if it grossed 190 million today. And the worldwide gross would have been 328 million. So that's pretty good from a budget that would have been $110 million if they had produced it today, which is that's a pretty good budget. That's a pretty hefty budget. That's there's nothing to sneeze at. That's a significant amount, I believe. And having a return of 328, that's a hit movie. It's a pretty good movie. It's well worth the effort, I should say. Now, the main reason that I wanted to do this, besides it being a fantastic film, was the recent passing of one of my favorite actors. His name is Gene Hackman, and he played Captain Frank Ramsey. And you may have seen some of his other films, including The French Connection or The Royal Tenenbaums, or another one of my favorite movies, Unforgiven. Probably the first Western that I've ever seen in the theater. And I covered that on episode 61. And The Quick and the Dead. Actually, when I think about it, I don't know if I've seen The Quick and the Dead first or Unforgiven first. But The Quick and the Dead is another one of my favorites. And what's interesting about that movie and Unforgiven is that I feel like Gene Hackman pretty much played the exact same character. And you love him for it. I covered The Quick and the Dead in episode number 81. I had a fun time recording that episode. And yeah, it's just that he has, some people want to think of him as a character actor, and he can play certain types of characters, but he definitely has a wide range that he can draw from. And he's just a joy to watch. He brings that tension and that intensity when you need to. And then he can be comedic, even playing off of himself or off of his own intensity when the role requires it. So Gene Hackman, ladies and gentlemen, may he rest in peace. Up next is Denzel Washington. He plays Lieutenant Commander Ron Hunter. You may have seen him in Fences, The Book of Eli, Virtuosity, which I just covered in episode 170, and Philadelphia, that I covered a few episodes earlier in episode 156. Another fantastic actor. What I read, I don't know if I put this in the trivia, but what I had found out is that Denzel Washington took this role specifically so that he could work with Gene Hackman. He wanted to study under the masters. He said something to that effect. And what's interesting is that is the effect that Gene Hackman has on other actors. That's another thing. That's one of the reasons why Will Smith was eager to work with Gene Hackman in a movie that they were in together, to get a chance to work with somebody who really has the experience and the knowledge and the respect of the acting community. Up next is Matt Craven. He played Lieutenant Roy Zimmer. You may have seen him in A Few Good Men, X-Men First Class, or Jacob's Ladder. And what's interesting is that Matt Craven just has that type of face where you recognize him. Another actor that's like that has that face is George Zunza. And he plays the chief of the boat, or Cobb. They didn't actually give him a name. I think he's the only character, or he's the only main character that doesn't have a name. And unless you consider it maybe that his name is Mr. Cobb, but that's entirely too coincidental that his name would be Cobb and his role on a boat is Cobb. So, and Cobb is shorthand that a lot of military have shorthand for certain jobs. Like in the Army, there's a similar position called the first sergeant, but he's referred to as top, and everybody calls him top instead of first sergeant a lot of times. So, when I consider this, I think that they just didn't name this character. In any case, you may have seen him also in Basic Instinct, or The Deer Hunter, or Dangerous Minds. I don't know what he's playing in Dangerous Minds. He was probably playing a teacher. I should probably cover Dangerous Minds. It was so impactful. Not necessarily one of my favorite movies, but it was one of those impactful movies that came out during that, during the 90s. One of those 90s movies. Up next is Viggo Mortensen. He plays Lieutenant Peter Wepps, NC. And you might have seen him in any of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or you might have seen him in Eastern Promises. But what I remember him for is that time that he played the devil in a movie called The Prophecy. That's another movie that I need to cover. I need to put that one on the list. Up next is James Gandolfini. He played Lieutenant Bobby Doherty, and you may have seen him in Enough Said, Killing Them Softly, or Get Shorty. I covered that in episode 165. It's funny because before I started doing this podcast, the only thing I knew James Gandolfini was for The Sopranos. And now it seems like he's been busy the entire time. He was there the entire time. Up next is Rocky Carroll. You may have seen him. Well, I'm sorry. He plays Lieutenant Derek Westergaard. And you may have seen him in Yes Man or Ladies Man. But if you don't remember him from those movies, then you remember him from his laundry list of TV roles that he played. And he's also been in one of his most notable TV roles was the character he plays in NCIS. So another Navy connection. Up next is Lilo Brancato. He plays Petty Officer Third Class Russell Vossler. You may have seen him in A Bronx Tale or Renaissance Man. And then at last I have Danny Newsey. He plays Petty Officer First Class Danny Rivetti, and he's been in The Titanic and Alive. Crimson Tide was directed by Tony Scott. You may have seen some of Tony Scott's other movies, including Domino, Unstoppable, Top Gun, True Romance, Spy Game, or Enemy of the State. All of these are fantastic movies. I've seen all of these except for True Romance, which maybe I should go and revisit. It would seem to me that Tony Scott really loves that action thriller, and he stays squarely in that pocket, or he had stayed squarely in that pocket. Sadly, he had passed away some years ago, but I feel like I've enjoyed a lot of his movies. This movie was written by Michael Schiffer and Richard P. Henrik. As far as Schiffer is concerned, he's written other movies such as Colors, The Peacemaker, Lean on Me, The Four Feathers. Of all of these, Lean on Me is definitely my favorite. And Hendrick, I don't feel like he's like a regular movie writer. He only has Crimson Tide as his credit, and the only other movie he's been involved in was a TV movie called Counter-Strike, where he wrote the novel and they made a TV movie based on his novel. The music is by Hans Zimmer, and you may have heard his music in Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, or Interstellar, or Inception, or The Creator, or No Time to Die. What's interesting about his movie is that he's always, well, maybe not always, but for many of his projects, he goes for the unusual. He is like, when you're doing a movie and you want something strange, you want to go to Hans Zimmer. He's going to give you something slightly strange. And one of the things that really told me that was the soundtracks for Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2. It's like he really went for the gusto in making the music for that movie, or for those two movies. And then there's this movie where I didn't realize it, but he was using a lot of synthesized instruments, and he was blending the synthesized sounds with traditional music to come up with a unique blend in this score. And I really I don't think I ever actually clocked or heard or was able to register the synthesized music, because it all sound like traditional music to me, and it sound like a vaguely Russian score. I feel like the soundtrack in this movie would have been just as home if they were doing a movie about a Russian submarine as they were doing a movie about a U.S. submarine. It didn't feel particularly American, but it really did pull you into the movie significantly. It was a key to have this music in this movie. That's it for the opening credits. And I actually have some new announcements. So either this week as the time that you're listening to this, or maybe next week, there will be an episode released from a different podcast. I'll be making a guest appearance on Not a Bomb podcast, and it's one of my favorite shows. It is a show about the movies that had bombed at the box office, and they examine these movies and they try to figure out if these movies actually deserve to bomb or if they should not be considered bombs. It's like, if, yeah, sure, they failed financially, but some of these movies are good enough where they should have been financial successes. And they cover some very interesting movies. And this month, in the month of March, they're doing something a little bit different. They're doing a type of versus podcast. So they're pitting two bombs against each other, two bombs that have a similar theme. So, for example, one of the earlier movies was Terminal Velocity versus Drop Zone. It's their parachute action films. And then later they did Spy Hard versus Wrongfully Accused. These are two Leslie Nielsen bombs. Later on, they'll be doing Blank Man versus Meteor Man, African American superhero films. But the films that I've chosen to watch with them is Showtime versus Metro. These are, they call Axel Foley light films. So these are films where Eddie Murphy plays a police officer, but he's not playing Axel Foley. So I'm really excited to talk about these two movies. I've not seen these two movies before, and it's going to be very interesting. So that's what's coming up on, like I said, either probably the last week of March or right around the time that you're hearing this episode. Go look for Not a Bomb podcast. Also, near the end of April, or perhaps the first week of May, I'll have a guest spot on Movie Lovers Unite, and that'll be with host John D. Gregorio, and we'll be talking about Warrior. I've not seen Warrior. I've always heard about Warrior, and I'm looking forward to watching Warrior. Will it be, or is it Warriors? I think it's Warriors. Anyways, I can't even get the name of the movie right, but I'm really excited about seeing Warriors. And it's good to get together with John. He's a really good dude. And Movie Lovers Unite is a great podcast. So go check that out when you get the chance. And as usual, check out backlickcinema.com. Check out the shop. Check out the designs at the shop. Pick out something you like. And also still working on Bazaar de Alonso, the eBay shop, which will eventually come out. So that's it for the announcements. Back to the show. So, this movie had a lot. And I like to try to examine or explore the theme or the themes that this movie may have had. I think that it's more about the balance of duty and command with the larger philosophical questions of, the consequences or the grave consequences that might come from blindly following orders. And it's a dynamic that you see kind of played out. So you have Captain Ramsey, and he really is a type to just blindly follow orders. And then you have his XO, Hunter, who is more philosophical, trying to look at the consequences. It's not that he won't blindly follow orders. Like, if he had orders that were authenticated that said that, we have to launch nuclear weapons, then he would think about the consequences, but he would still follow his orders because, he's not going to question his orders. But if there is a chance that he can stop a nuclear holocaust, an unnecessary nuclear holocaust, then he's going to take that chance. He's going to hold on to whatever strings that he has to hold on to in order to prevent like the destruction of the whole world. And so you have these two philosophies butt heads, and it's not necessarily a simple-minded captain, but just a determined captain. Is a captain that is narrowly focused on simply completing the mission. And then you have his XO, who is more learned, more thoughtful, I guess, and more concerned with larger issues outside of just following orders. So that immediately kind of sets up the confrontation that later is executed in the film. And the thing about it is that it starts with the interview. So the captain, he needs a new XO. Something happened to his previous second officer, or first officer, I should say. So he's interviewing Hunter, and you can see that the captain has, I don't know if he has any misgivings about Hunter. He's just basically going off of his feels, and he feels like Hunter is going to be a good first officer, and he's not all that concerned with any conflict that may arise. But still, it feels like there is a slight tension. And I believe there's only because the tension only exists because it's the type of tension that you would have when you're interviewing for a new job. That is the tension that is there. And you can kind of feel that. And that's one of my favorite parts. It's like the movie kind of starts off right away, it's almost like setting you up for the tension that's going to come on later down the line in the film. And like in a more recent movie that I just watched, that movie was Judgment Night. The tension starts off, and like in that movie, there really was no real tension at the very beginning of the film. But I feel like in this movie, the tension starts off in the very beginning, and then slowly but surely, just bit by bit, just sort of ramps up, and then the tension jumps and leaps and bounds, and you have actions and submarine battles and so on and so on. But I like how this interview kind of sets you up for that. Once again, one of my favorite things about all military movies is the military jargon. It's like I'm kind of a sucker for that. The military speak that they use to communicate with each other, and going about their work and business at hand. So it almost goes without saying. I think every time I'm watching a military movie, and I get into the jargon that they use, it's always one of my favorite parts of the movie. So another one of my favorite parts is essentially Gene Hackman, but not Gene Hackman by himself, but the dynamic that he has with Denzel Washington. Like, so Gene Hackman is constantly like, it's almost like he has he's radiating tension. Like wherever he goes, he's radiating tension. And a lot of that is directed at Denzel Washington, and how Denzel Washington kind of sells the tension that, that he's selling those vibes, right? It's almost like, and I'm using a term from professional wrestling. So in selling, like in wrestling, obviously, that in wrestling, the outcomes are predetermined, and the people that are engaged in wrestling, they're not actually trying to hurt each other. They're trying to do their performance as safely as possible. Now, obviously, people will get hurt. It's like you can't throw somebody on a mat and them not getting hurt, but you try to do it so as safely as possible, so that they can do another match maybe later on that night or later on in the week. So it's a job. So once a wrestler is thrown to the ground, it's that wrestler's job to act as though it's the most pain that they ever felt in their life, or some such thing. So, so they're selling that, even though the wrestler's not that hurt, he's selling it as though he is. So the audience can feel it. One of my favorite things that happens in wrestling is like somebody gets slammed to the ground or slammed to the pole, and they're on the ground and they're in so much pain that they bang their leg against the ground, and it's almost like they're communicating to the audience that that's a lot of pain, and it's like, I'm in so much pain, I don't know what to do with it. And I remember when I used to watch wrestling, I used to feel it every single time, and I kind of feel it within this movie, and it's so subtle, but in the subtle ways that Washington reacts to Hackman, like when Hackman is like, not even, he'll say something a particular way, and then you have Washington reacting to it, and it's like his reactions that really sell that tension that Hackman gives off, and I really love that. And there's also there are points in the movie where Hackman is he'll like give an order, and then it's like Washington doesn't quite respond. And I'm not talking about the actors themselves, I'm talking about the characters. So like the Captain Ramsey would give an order, and then Hunter won't quite respond in the way the captain would want him to. And he gives a look. There's a look on his face like a parent that's disappointed in their child. So it's stuff like that. It's that I really enjoy, that really sells the movie. This ratcheting up of the tension is something that leads to one of my other favorite parts. It's the fire. It's the first action sequence in the movie. So there's an accident in a fire in a galley, and the crew's trying to pull it out or whatever. And then the XO Hunter, goes down and helps in putting out the fire. And most of the personnel are fine, if not hurt, but one person got hurt, was the chief that was in charge of the galley, and somehow he was harmed. I don't know if he was harmed because he got burnt, or it seemed like smoke inhalation or some such thing. They don't really explain. Only that at the end of the exercise, or at the end when they put out the fire, you have them trying to resuscitate the chief, and they're unable to. But it's unclear what actually caused his what actually killed him, or his cause of death. But what happened is that they have this fire. They put out the fire. Everybody is relieved, and right at that moment, the captain decides, like knowing that there's a fire, or that they put out the fire. Right at that moment, this does a emergency action message drill. So this is a drill where they go through all the performance of receiving an emergency message and authenticating the message, and in following orders from on high to do this, that, or the other. The emergency action message could mean anything, and they have to respond to it extremely quickly. The message has to be received. It has to be authenticated by certain crew members. And finally, the message has to be authenticated by the XO and the captain, and they have to agree that the order is authentic, and then they carry out these orders. So it's a whole rigmarole of people running around the ship in order to engage this message. And the captain runs this drill that the crew has to run around right after they put out the fire. And and it's one of the things that the XO is not particularly happy about. And it's not like he openly complains to the captain, but you can feel his displeasure, right? So that was, and the captain knows that the XO is not happy about that, and kind of needles the point to the XO. It's like, well, the crew has to be ready. These things can happen at any time, and the crew, and it doesn't matter if there's an actual emergency. One of these emergency action messages could come, and so that's why he chose to do the drill. And I think that it kind of solidifies the reputation of the captain being a hard ass. I think that part of him doing the drill at that time was to solidify his reputation, as well as to make sure his crew is ready to respond to these emergency messages. Essentially because they're on a patrol in which they could be asked to launch these nuclear weapons. So this is one of those things that further elevates that tension in the movie, and elevates that tension between the captain and his XO. And I love that conversation that happens like right after both the fire and the drill, and how the captain confronts the XO's displeasure with what the captain had done. And then the captain said something strange. He said, So he's referring to the death of the chief of the galley. And basically what he says, it was he says this because the galley chief is overweight. He says that it was his 300 pounds that killed him, not the fire, which is a weird thing to say. Because why would you say that? Because the fire wasn't the captain's fault. It was an accidental fire. They never explored what happened with the fire, who started the fire or why it could have been a faulty electrical service circuit. Nobody knows why the fire. Well, they never actually explained why the fire started. But the only thing that is clear is that it's not the captain's fault. And what he says when he says that it wasn't the fire that killed the galley man, it was the 300 pounds. It's why are you being defensive? Like what was that all about? It's like why do you feel the need to say that? It's like that's. First of all, it's not your place to say because you're not a doctor. The chief medical officer didn't expressly say that the galley cook died because he had a heart attack or whatever. It could have been smoke inhalation, and it doesn't matter how much you weigh if you die because of smoke inhalation, or maybe he got burned in a vital part. I don't think it was due to burns because it doesn't seem like you were addressing any burns. When we find the chief medical officer, they're trying to revive the chief of the galley, and they're doing CPR. So it seems like it could have been a heart attack, or it could have been smoke inhalation. In any case, it's not the captain's role to say what killed the man. That's the chief medical officer, and so it's weird that he would say that. Nobody blamed you for the fire. Why are you being defensive? And it could be responding to his decision to start this emergency action message drill right after the fire, and he's being defensive in that way. Not exactly sure, but I think that in some ways he's not 100% secure in what his motives are. It's like maybe he was having second thoughts about running that drill. At least so close after the fire. So one of my other favorite parts is basically all of the submarine battles. So there are two major submarine battles. So the first one is when they get the first actual EAM message. And that's kind of a dumb thing to say. Saying EAM message is almost like saying ATM machine. Like you don't have to say ATM machine. And you don't have to say EAM message. Anyway, that's beside the point. So they get the first EAM, and it is authenticated. And basically, it's funny how they get an actual EAM message, like not long after they have the EAM drill. So maybe the captain was right. At any case. They get the message. They authenticate the message. The message tells them that they are to prepare to launch their nuclear weapons. And so they go through the rigmarole of doing that. And there's like no hesitation on anybody's part about following these orders. And then there is I'm not sure if it happens before or after they get menaced by, no, actually what happens is that after they get the message, they, move into position or anything. And then at the same time, they notice that there's an enemy submarine, from an enemy's Russian submarine that's stalking that area looking for enemy ships. And so they have to be careful. They have to hide. They have to dive deeper. They're basically just trying to avoid this enemy sub that's looking for them. But at the same time, they get another message. It's a partial. Wait, did they get I think they got attacked though. No, not yet. They didn't get attacked yet. So they get another EAM message while they're hiding from this other sub. But but because they're too deep underwater, because they're already deep underwater, the message isn't clear. It's like cut off. So the XO was like as far as the captain is concerned, because it's an incomplete message and because it can't be authenticated, then as far as he's concerned, it's nothing. It's a nothing message. He's going to continue with the previous mission. The XO is like, but it might be the command telling them to abort the mission. And the captain was like, well, without a complete message, I'm just going to follow the original message, which is to launch the missiles. And so the XO convinced the captain to, or suggests to the captain, maybe we can send up a buoy with an antenna, and the antenna can go up and it can improve their communications, and they can see if they can get the EAM message to tell them if the original orders had been canceled or confirmed or whatever. He wants to know what this new message is. And and I think that he desperately wants it to be a message that tells them not to launch the missiles. So the captain agrees to this. So they start to raise this antenna. And at the same time, they're trying to be silent because they're trying to hide from this attack submarine. And so it goes up. And of course, something goes wrong. It's like it's supposed to go up silently, but it gets caught in a jam. And when it's like a cable that's releasing this buoy, and the cable gets jammed. It makes this loud noise. It's like not announcing to the entire ocean where their position is. And Ramsey kind of looks at the XO like the XO personally did this, like it was personally the XO's fault for this mechanical failure. I mean, sure, there is a chance that the thing might jam, but at the same time, you're so busy running these EAM message drills that you could probably run a drill on this antenna to make sure that this antenna doesn't make any noise when it's in operation. But that didn't happen. So it makes a noise, the thing gets stuck, and they have to reel in the antenna, and then that basically signals to the attack submarine, the Russian attack submarine, exactly where they are. So it starts heading right for them. And so now it's firing missiles. They have to engage in battle. That they're able to avoid the missiles and the other submarine. They're able to find a different place, hide from the submarine. But because of the attack, now their communications is the communication buoy had been severed during the battle. So now they can't do that. They can't raise the buoy. So they can't receive the EAM message, and the captain doesn't want to surface because if they try to make the surface, they might get found by the attack submarine. So he doesn't have any intention of surfacing the sub until they're close enough to the surface where they can launch their nuclear missiles. Otherwise, they're just going to stay at a depth where they can't receive any messages. So the captain's starting to initiate the process of readying the ship to launch the nuclear missiles. And here's one of the things where I was uncertain about. So in this process, he issues the orders, or the series of orders to launch the nuclear missiles. And the the first officer, that being the XO, Lieutenant Commander Hunter, he has to repeat these orders, and that's his confirmation of these orders. But because Hunter has reservations about the orders, because of the second EAM message that they weren't able to confirm the second message, he does not repeat the orders. He does not confirm the captain's orders. And without his confirmation, they cannot launch the nuclear missiles. And I had to do a little bit of research on this, because what happens is that Lieutenant Commander Hunter refuses to acknowledge or repeat the captain's orders, and thus confirming the captain's orders. The captain decides that he's going to relieve Lieutenant Commander Hunter from duty and then replace Lieutenant Commander Hunter with his second officer. And he instructs that Hunter be removed from the con. I think that's what you call it. And that's when this is the first time that Hunter asserts himself. He major pushback against the captain, and it's like, remove Hunter from the bridge, and Hunter's like, oh no, you won't. And when people point out like the power of Gene Hackman's acting, this is one of the scenes that they talk about. They talk about that confrontation where Hunter is trying to be reasonable with the captain, and the captain is basically telling him, is refuting all of the reasoning that Hunter has. Like Hunter says something like, well, we don't have to follow these orders. There are other submarines in the area, and they can get the orders since we're unsure about our orders. And the captain was like, you're making the assumption that there are other boats in the water. I have to make the assumption that the other boats have been destroyed by the other enemy submarines. I have to assume that we're the only ones who are capable of carrying out the confirmed orders that we already have. And so there's a little bit back and forth, and the captain gets tired of the back and forth, and he basically just tells Hunter to shut the fuck up. And so that was one of the that was a very powerful scene. So that leads to the captain having Hunter, trying to get Hunter removed from the bridge. Now Hunter says, like, according to naval regulations, that there has to be that he has to confirm the orders and he has to give his consent, and he doesn't. And because the captain tried to circumvent the naval regulations, the captain is in the wrong. And so he's ordering the captain to be, he's relieving the captain of duty. And then he's ordering the captain to be placed, in his room. What do you call that? To be detained in the captain's quarters. But here's the thing. That was the thing that I was confused about. Cause in most other stories where you, about the Navy, it's more like, the captain's, the captain's authority can't be really circumvented in that way. Or I've never seen it circumvented in that way. And so in my research, I finally found where that comes from. So this comes from what's called the two-man protocol, and it's very specific to launching of nuclear weapons. And we kind of see this also in war games, where when you receive an order to launch a nuclear missile, there has to be at least two people to engage in the operation of actually launching the missile. And they both have to authenticate certain messages. They both have to have certain keys. The keys have to be turned at the same time. And they basically, both of them have to be in agreement in launching the missile, or the missile doesn't get launched. So that same protocol follows in a submarine. So because it's a situation with a nuclear missile, the captain can't simply replace his first officer and get somebody to agree with him. It has to be his first officer to agree with them to launch the nuclear missiles. And actually, apparently, on a U.S. naval submarine, it's the captain, the first officer, and the weapons officer. And we kind of see that play out in the movie, where the captain is trying to launch the missiles, and it requires the weapon officer, and that officer cannot in good conscience pull the trigger on these nuclear weapons. And so that was what I was confused about. But apparently there's a certain amount of precedence for this. So now I can more thoroughly enjoy the movie now that that question has been solved. Cause I had a double of a time trying to figure out how authentic that part of the plot was. The first officer being the XO, being Ron Hunter, he takes over the ship, places the captain in the captain's quarters, basically locks him in there. And then he proceeds with the plan to find out what that message was, what the EAM message was. So they start going to the surface. But then, just as the captain feared, they get found out. They get found by the attack submarine. So they have to engage in this other battle. As I said, these are my favorite parts. It looks incredible. So the attack submarine comes along. It starts firing missiles. And the other thing about this is that Lieutenant Commander Hunter doesn't have any actual battle experience. Everything that he knows comes from engaging in drills and practice, but he's never been in an actual battle. So you kind of wonder how he's going to perform. Like he's book smart, but is he tactically smart? Like, is he capable? This is his first test. And the person who's actually ever engaged in naval battle is the captain. And the captain is locked in his stateroom, or his, what do you call it? And on a Navy ship. I don't know. Anyways, the captain's locked up. So is basically Hunter essentially by himself, and he's issuing these orders, and he's able to successfully defeat this attack submarine and actually engaging with his own missiles and destroying the other Navy sub. But not before the Navy sub was able to get off one final shot, one final missile that the Alabama is just barely able to avoid. And even though they avoid the actual explosion, they're close enough where it severely damages the submarine. And it knocks out their propulsion, and it starts to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And so now they're going down, and they're going down and they're heading down quickly to crush depth, the depth of the ocean, where it's just going to squash the submarine like it's so much tinfoil can. And in the meantime, throughout all this, the captain's just in the stateroom, just kind of reading, because there's nothing he can do at that point. But it is at this point where there are crew members that are loyal to the captain. They're not happy with the situation. They're not happy that the captain was relieved of duty, and they think that particular move was illegitimate. So they break in to see the captain. It's mainly Lieutenant Bob Doherty, played by James Gandolfini. He's the most perturbed by the captain being locked in his room. So he goes down there. I think he has one other officer with him, but he goes down there. He sees the captain. He's like, and even though the captain's quarters is guarded, he basically uses his authority over these, seamen as an officer, and basically bullies them to get out of the way and let him in the room. And so the captain, with him, devised a plan. He tells them the crew members that are needed for the captain to retake the ship. And one of the crew members that's absolutely vital is Lieutenant NC, who they call Weps for some reason. And I think they call him Weps because he sweats all the time, because he does a lot of sweating in this movie. It's played by Vito Mortensen. And the dynamic is that Peter, or Lieutenant Peter NC, he's really good friends with the XO, with Ron Hunter. They're very good friends. They family hang out together. They used to serve on the same ship before, so they're very good friends. So he has to either be loyal to his captain or be loyal to his friend. And so initially he's loyal to his captain. It took a lot of convincing, but they was able to get him on the captain's side. And they got a couple of other crew members. And this leads to, and this is the actual mutiny, because if what Lieutenant Commander Ron Hunter did was correct in relieving the captain of his duty, and it was seconded by the chief of the boat. The chief of the boat says that, what the XO was saying to the captain was correct, that the captain could not continue to issue orders about releasing the nuclear weapons without the consent of his XO. And so that captain's order at that point become illegitimate. And that gives the XO the authority to relieve the captain of duty. And it was supported by the chief of the boat. And it was basically under the chief of the boat's authority that the men went and they confined the captain to his quarters. That was the phrase I was looking for originally, confined to his quarters. Anyways, so it was really the captain committing a mutiny on his own boat, essentially. So the captain retakes the boat, confines the XO, the chief of the boat, and some other crew members that are still loyal to the XO in one of the staterooms. In the meantime, you have the petty officer Russell Vossler. I think he's the one. Or it could have been Petty Officer Rivetti. One of those two. they were working on communications, and they were trying to repair the communications equipment that had been damaged in the second submarine battle. So they're basically working uninterrupted, except when Captain Hunter calls and basically puts an extraordinary amount of pressure on them to fix the radio equipment. So he's fixing the equipment. There are mutinies and counter mutinies going on all around him, and he's able to work uninterrupted. And I loved all of that. But at the end, because there's a mutiny where the captain takes over the boat again, and he's taking it, and he's preparing to launch the weapons, and then there is an incident where the XO is able to escape his own captivity. He calls Lieutenant NC, or he calls Weps, and he says, Weps, you can't launch the nuclear weapons. The captain needs you to launch it. You can't launch the weapons. You absolutely have to launch it. And Weps kind of hangs up on him because it's like Weps can't take that type of pressure. And that's why Weps is sweating all the time. It's like every time you see him, it's like he's the only one that's sweating. Nobody in the whole boat is sweating. It's just Weps sweating. So when the captain gives a order to launch the missiles, NC, basically the XO got to NC, or Weps, whatever you want to call him. And then Weps decides that, because he's like worried about killing everybody on Earth too. And he's also has a certain amount of loyalty to his friend, the XO. And so it's those two type of things where he just decides not to fire, or not to open the safe to grab the trigger to fire the nuclear weapons. He just decides not to do it. And his department is telling him, it's like, we got to launch the missiles. The captain just gave the order to launch the missile, and just Weps just stands there smoking a cigarette because he doesn't want to do it. So the captain realizes that Weps has lost his nerve, and he takes some of his bridge crew, and they go down to the weapons officer, or the weapons department, to talk to Weps. And he leaves somebody else in charge. Because at this point, the XO and his compatriots are already out of confinement, and they go and they realize what the captain is doing. So they retake the bridge, and they take the key out so that the people in weapons control can't launch the nukes. When the captain, I didn't list this as my favorite part, but I definitely I got to talk about this anyway, because it's definitely somebody's favorite part. So the captain is in the weapons department, and he's trying to get Weps to unlock the safe, because only Weps has a combination. And another thing is, like, I'm not exactly sure how authentic this is. I feel like there would be some kind of double redundancy where that if Weps was killed or hurt, then there would be another officer who knew the combination to the safe who can open the safe. I'm thinking that it's not just one person on the entire boat that knows how to open the safe, but that's the way it's set up in this movie. So at first, the captain threatens to blow Weps' head off, but he realizes that it's not going to work, because Weps is the only person on the ship that knows the combination. So he threatens this little petty officer, just this kid. He doesn't even know this kid's name. He has to read the kid's name tag to find out who he is. I'm gonna blow this kid's head off if you don't open that safe. 1, 2, and you could see that the captain really means it. It's like, not only is he determined that he's going to kill this innocent kid, but he has a whole room full of people that the captain can then murder in order to get NC to open this safe. And so finally, Indian's like, when NC is not going to let that happen. So he opens the safe, and the captain pushes him aside, grabs the trigger. So I'm pretty sure that's somebody's favorite part. The captain tries to fire their missiles, but they don't fire because the launch key at the bridge has been removed. So now they got to go back up to the bridge, and they basically retake the bridge again. But is at this point where the communications officer says, like, I almost got it. I almost got the communications up. It's breathing. It's just about up. And so the captain decides to acquiesce to the XO. It's like he's in command of the boat. He's got the bridge again. He's got the boat again. His men is basically taking over the bridge, and he and the XO kind of sit down and decide to talk about ponies or horses. They talk about these certain type of horses while the communications petty officer is trying to get the comm back up again. So he's able to do it. He gets the comm up. And actually, before I get into that, the conversation that they have, and I don't know how many favorite parts that I went over. I think that I shall consider this my last favorite part. So they're sitting there and they're talking about the ponies while the comm dude is trying to get the comm up to see if they can get that second emergency action message. And as they're talking about it, they're talking about these certain kind of horses where, so the captain is saying these horses are from Spain, and the XO is like, no, they're not from Spain. They're Arabia. They're from Portugal. And, the captain is like, yeah, they're wonderful horses, but they're from Spain. And that kind of sets up the dynamic between the captain and XO, is that because they have completely different worldviews. I mean, from their point of perspective, they are right. It's like, they're not wrong. They're right in their perspective. It's like, there's no good guy or bad guy. Each person is doing what they believe is the correct action. It's like, it's almost like there are no antagonists in this movie. There's no antagonist as such. It's like, because, I mean, it's not in a traditional way. It's like, either men could be correct and either men could be wrong. And their perspective is, it's not like you're dealing with like a bank robber who he might feel that what he's doing the right thing, but he knows that he's breaking the law, or a murderer who knows that what he's doing is wrong. It's not so cut and dry as that. There are certain people who do certain things that, even though they might believe that they are correct, they know that it is against societal standards, or it's against the law, or it's against what, public perception would be against them if they were to be found out that they were doing this thing. It's against traditions, it's against morals, it's against their religion. They know that there's something wrong with it. But in this instance, what the situation we're doing that we're dealing with on this boat is that both factions believe that they are right to the core. And so that's what this conversation about these horses bring up, is that the captain believes that these horses are from Spain and he believes that he is right. And then you have the XO who believes the horses are from Portugal and he believes that he is right. And so the message actually comes through. They go through they kind of do an abbreviated version of the emergency action message, where the captain doesn't necessarily wait for everybody to authenticate the message. He kind of snatches the paper. And what the paper says is that the nuclear launch has been canceled. So they don't have to launch the nuclear missiles. And so essentially, the XO was essentially correct in waiting for a confirmation that the second message was supposed to have. So the captain basically turns the ship over to the XO and goes back to the stateroom. And in a final resolution, they're in I forgot, they're on a naval base and they have to face like a kind of a 3-judge panel. And you have the admiral and then the adjutants, or I'm not exactly sure what you call these people. There's at least one admiral in charge though. And so he's trying to figure out what to do, because on the one hand, he's saying that what they did was right, and on the other hand, he said what they did was both wrong, and that it's going to occupy the Navy for decades to figure out what to do about this situation, or what they're going to have to change. But at the end, they decided that Captain Ramsey can retire with honors. And under Ramsey's recommendation, they can promote Lieutenant Commander Ron Hunter to get his own boat to command. So those are the things that happen in this movie. At the end, when they leave the office and it's like Ramsey. Ron Hunter wants to thank Ramsey for the recommendation, because like at the beginning he was a little bit nervous because the the panel was going to proceed without Commander or Lieutenant Commander's Hunter testimony. And the panel was like, or the admiral was like, I've known Captain Ramsey for, X amount of years, and he's never lied to us before, and I don't expect for him to lie to us now. So yeah, we are going to proceed. And that's when he learned that Ramsey had recommended to the panel that he receive his own command, because he acted with, honor and integrity and all the flowery languages that the military likes to use to show that a person is good and fit. So when they leave the office, it's Commander Ron Hunter who wants to thank Captain Frank Ramsey. And Frank Ramsey, he's like simply says, well, you were right and I was wrong. And then he says, about the horses are from Portugal. And that's funny because it makes you laugh. It's a really cool joke. But the thing about that is that the argument or the discussion, it wasn't even really an argument, but the discussion that they had about the horses was basically a subtle reference to the situation that they were in. That it served as a proxy argument for the situation that they were dealing with on the boat. So when they had that discussion on the boat, Captain Ramsey, when he talked about horses, wasn't really talking about horses. He was talking about the things that the whole situation that they were dealing with when they were on the boat. And then at the end of the movie, when the situation was resolved and Captain Ramsey was telling XO Ron Hunter that he was right, he was telling him he was right. By telling him that he was right about the horses, he was kind of telling him that he was right about the situation on the boat, which is why he got recommended his own boat to command. So that was a lovely movie. And those are some of my favorite parts. What are your favorite parts? Let me know. Why don't you drop me a line at fanmail@backlickcinema.com and let me know what you thought of Crimson Tide and what your favorite parts of the movie were. Or if you have any extra insight on naval command or naval procedures, that would be helpful as well. And now that we've dealt with our favorite parts, let's check out the trivia top 10. Or the top 10 trivia. I really hadn't decided what to call this segment. It's just the trivia segment. The trivia that's mostly provided by IMDb. But this time I got some further clarification by going over to Wikipedia. And I think it is in this section that I get some clarification about some of the things, some of the plot points that happen in the movie. So let's start with this. The refusal of an executive officer to agree in launching nuclear weapons due to a fragment order is based on a similar incident within the Soviet Navy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarine B-59 attempted to infiltrate the U.S. Navy blockade by running submerged. By doing so, they had been out of contact for several days with Moscow at a depth they ran at. When U.S. destroyers dropped signal depth charges to force the sub to surface, the Soviet captain Valentin Grigorovich Savitsky believed war had broken out between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. His sentiments were concurred by the onboard political officer, Ivan Semenovich Maslenikov. However, Savitsky's second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, who also was the flotilla commodore, refused. All three needed to agree before launching. Being out of contact for so long and with no clear orders, Arkhipov convinced Captain Savitsky to surface, and they found themselves surrounded by U.S. destroyers. Their communication was reestablished with Moscow, and they received orders to return home, thereby preventing nuclear war. So part of this story that we saw in this movie is based on this incident. And I was wondering if that agreement between the officers was absolutely necessary, or was a procedure that was required in the U.S. as well as the Soviet Union, or was just something a procedure that the Navy didn't have that they borrowed from the Soviet Union. And then as I continued my research, I got clarification. Also, I wanted to kind of point out that the destroyers were dropping signal depth charges, and these depth charges aren't designed to damage submerged vessels. They're only designed to signal or serve as a signal to submerged vessels that they've been spotted and they need to surface in order to find out why they're there. It's like the whole purpose of the submarine is to stealthily go about doing war business, and basically that submarine had been found out. It's so the destroyers on the surface is like, we know you're down there, come up, we need to communicate. And as I said, these are signal depth charges. They're not designed to cause any damage to the submarines. But the submarine captain thought that that's what they were. He thought they were under attack. He's like, oh my God, they're dropping depth charges. We'll find out. Let's launch our missiles before they hit us. And the political officer was like, I concur. Let's launch the missiles. And that's when the second in command of the vessel was like, no, we shouldn't. We hadn't been given any orders to launch our nuclear payload. Let's go to the surface and see what's what. And basically you had the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, saving the day and indeed preventing nuclear war, because he refused to go along with the captain's orders. He didn't blindly follow the captain's orders, and they actually needed to be in agreement in order to launch the nuclear missiles. So the second thing I found out in the trivia is that since the U.S. Navy would not cooperate with the filming for several scenes, the French Navy allowed the use of one of their Triumphant class ballistic missile submarines, along with the aircraft carrier Foch. So the aircraft carrier is the one that we see in the beginning and at the end of the movie. And I'm not sure which one of the subs was that they're referring to in the movie, but that's usually something that they could get from the U.S. Navy if the Navy were cooperating. But, with the talk of mutiny being part of the plot, the Navy did not want to cooperate. Up next, Tony Scott obtained footage of the real USS Alabama departing Pearl Harbor through possibly illegal means. A paid civilian informant tipped off Scott to the day and time of Alabama's sortie from port, an obvious violation of Navy ship movement regulations. Scott then had camera boats and a helicopter on standby to film the surfaced sub. Reportedly, the Alabama's captain requested assistance to remove the film crew, but then simply decided to submerge the sub prematurely, footage Scott was hoping to obtain anyway. Although the Navy issued a formal protest about using its equipment in the film without permission, it was not illegal as the sub was in public view and they could do nothing to prevent it. Interestingly, Scott was hoping only to obtain footage of an Ohio-class sub in motion on the surface. The fact that the boat was the actual USS Alabama was sheer coincidence. So a little bit of rogue filmmaking on the part of Tony Scott. And I think that the part that was illegal was how he got the information that a submarine was leaving port, because at this point he could not get the Navy to cooperate. So he did a little apparently he paid somebody to let him know when a submarine was leaving port, and any sub would have probably been sufficient, or any sub that's close to the type of submarine that's supposed to be in his movie. And he basically lucked out because he got the actual USS Alabama, and they must have cheered. They must have had champagne. They must have celebrated with that stealthy bit of filmmaking. Up next, Denzel Washington took this role so he would have an opportunity to be, quote, being there jousting with the master, end quote. So I believe he's referring to Gene Hackman. I believe that Gene Hackman got a lot in his life with actors wanting to act with him or act against him or be in the same room with him to basically sharpen up their skills. The disagreement between Captain Ramsey and Lieutenant Commander Hunter over the origin of the Lapizanar stallions throughout the movie foreshadows and illustrates the fundamental source of friction between the two men, both insisting that their mutually exclusive version of reality is the truth. Ironically, Captain Ramsey, who believes the stallions were Portuguese, and Lieutenant Commander Hunter, who says that they are Spanish, are both incorrect. The Lapizanar stallions are in fact Slovenian. They originate from a town called Lipica. However, the horses are generally associated with Spanish riding school of Vienna, Austria. So Hunter was technically closer to the truth than Ramsey. Up next, the last 60 minutes of the movie is almost in real time. 60 minutes to launch, 60 minutes to the end of the credits. The time that elapses between when Ramsey says to Hunter, "You have 3 minutes," and the successful reception of the EAM is 2 minutes and 38 seconds. So it's interesting, and on one part or on one part, that this is actually in real time, and that's the time they take to talk about the horses. And then the other interesting thing is that they narrowly avoided nuclear disaster by a little more than 20 minutes. The Alabama bridge set was built on a huge hydraulic gimbal. The gimbal tilted the set to simulate the submarine's dive angles. Also, this was the same gimbal that was used in the movie The Hunt for the Red October a few years earlier. According to a 1995 Premiere Magazine article, when Quentin Tarantino visited the set, Denzel Washington confronted him about the use of the word nigger in his films. Tarantino got embarrassed and wanted to move the conversation to a more private area, and Washington said, quote, "No, if you're going to discuss it, let's discuss it now," end quote. In a 2012 interview with GQ magazine, Washington said that he had contacted Tarantino a few years after production and apologized for embarrassing him, asking him, quote, "You're going to walk around with that grudge for the rest of your life," end quote. He also called Tarantino, quote, "a fine artist," end quote. The same year, Washington's daughter, Katia Washington, worked as a production assistant on Tarantino's Django Unchained. So the interesting thing about this bit of trivia is that this is a conversation that we have had amongst ourselves in the Black community. Two main things. One, Quentin Tarantino's focus on feet, and two, he loves to use the word nigger in his film. He does it a lot. It's like an interesting amount of times that he uses that word in his movies. And we love his films, and we talk about, it's like, is it the proper use? Is he doing it too much? Is he doing it on purpose? And it's just a discussion that we have. It's like, I feel like he tends to use it when appropriate, but he also tends to use it more than other filmmakers might. He is dangerously close to an egregious amount. It's like more than absolutely necessary. So it's an interesting and ongoing conversation. The next one, Robert Towne received an urgent call from Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer one night regarding a key scene between Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. They wanted Towne to rewrite the discussion on the nature of war between the two characters, thus setting up a more plausible potential for conflict for the remainder of the film. Such was the urgency of the situation that Towne had to dictate his rewrite over the phone to Simpson and Bruckheimer. So that's kind of funny. And I think, I didn't do any further research on this, but I think the conversation that they're talking about is that there's a conversation of officers' mess. So there is a captain and he and his top officers, including his XO, obviously, they're all having dinner together, and they're having this conversation, and they're talking about war. And one of the things that they're asking about is, how, do you agree with the U.S. using nuclear bombs in World War II. And his attitude was, yes, drop it again, drop it multiple times, hit him again, hit those fuckers again. That was his attitude. But the XO has a more measured response. And ultimately, the XO's attitude was that in a world of nuclear weapons, war itself is the enemy. So even though he's a warrior, essentially, a naval warrior, the XO, Hunter, I think he sees his role as doing everything that he could do to prevent war. I mean, obviously, he'll go to war if he has to, but he feels that his role is to find ways to prevent war from happening. So, in that it doesn't escalate into a nuclear war. And because in a nuclear war, nobody wins. Or at least I believe that's what he thinks. And I think this is the conversation that they're talking about that Robert Towne had punched up. The last bit of trivia I have is the notable Quentin Tarantino script contributions. And that included Hunter calling himself Captain Kirk, dialogue about submarine films, The Enemy Below and Run Silent, Run Deep, and Hunter cornering Vivetti about his argument with Bonnefeld over whether Jack Kirby or Jean Morbius Gerard was the better artist to draw the Silver Surfer. So all the somewhat punchy, funny moments that happen in the film, we can thank Quentin Tarantino for. And so that's it for the trivia. I hoped that there was some interesting information for you. And now we're going to head on see what the critics thought. And now we're going to see what the critics thought. The critics over at the Rotten Tomatoes, they have it over at 89%. The audience score is 84%. Very high ratings over at Rotten Tomatoes. People love this film. Over at IMDb reviews, it trails a little at 7.4 out of 10. So Dolores Barkley from the Associated Press wrote, Crimson Tide is a whale of a movie, an intense and heart-stopping adventure played out against the unnerving threat of nuclear annihilation. And I concur. I agree with that sentiment. Kevin Carr from 7M Pictures wrote, I don't know what the full naval procedure is to launch nuclear weapons, but I hope to God it's more structured and fail-safe than what we see in this film. Actually, apparently it's pretty fail-safe, according to the film, because in the film, we see that you do need the officers involved with launching the nuclear weapons. First of all, they need to be in agreement. At least two of them apparently need to be in agreement. And if the two can't agree, then they can't launch the nuclear weapons. So it seems pretty fail-safe. And then they've got a bunch of keys and they got to decode codes to make sure they're not receiving false messages from the enemy. There's a bunch of stuff that they got to do. It's like and then they don't actually have the authority to actually launch the weapons on their own. They have to actually get authorization from command. And then I think there are some further steps that they kind of skipped over in the movie. But at the same time, Kevin, I also hope that there's a little more fail-safe and a more structured approach to launching nuclear weapons. So up next we have Sarah Cartland from Caution Spoilers. She wrote, perfectly paced high-stakes drama with a brain. Its dilemmas both huge in scope and deeply personal, heart-stopping as it is watching torpedoes head toward Hackman and Washington sub. The arguments, the standoffs on board are just as shredding. And yes, I concur. I agree with that. And Janet Maslin from the New York Times wrote, isn't there something awfully satisfying about the throbbing missiles and cathartic explosions that constitute the film's main excitement? Maybe so, but nothing else here delivers a comparable thrill. And that is sadly misguided. I'll say it's misguided because that tension between the captain and the XO is magnifique. Or the way, and they each had somebody that betrays them. Like you had the XO, he had his best friend on the sub, and his best friend initially sided with the captain. And so, he gives him that look. It's like, you betrayed me. How dare you betray me? That he gave him that look when he had to give up the ship. And then by that same token, the captain had his Cobb betray him, because the Cobb and the captain, they go way back. But when it really mattered, the Cobb had sided with naval regulations. When the captain was wrong, he called out the captain for being wrong. And he had essentially not really siding with the XO, he's siding with the regulations. So the captain looking at Cobb like Cobb betrayed him. And it's like, you can feel the tension. And the tension is just all throughout the movie. So, and apparently Janet Maslin didn't feel that. And then that's her problem. So finally, Crimson Tide is, as of this recording, available on Prime Video. Now I want to switch gears to something completely different. And I'm inspired by a podcast that I've been listening to called Doom Generation. And they had revisited a film from my childhood a few days earlier. So I want to go and I want to watch that same film. Now here's the kicker. The last time I tried to watch this film, and this was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I couldn't get through it. So I don't even know if I could call it one of my favorite movies. All I can say that it was one of my favorite movies when I was growing up. I love this movie, but when I tried to watch it as an adult, I had issues and complications. I could barely stay awake. So I'm going to re-explore this movie and see if I can get through it and then see if I can enjoy it. And that movie is The Dark Crystal. So join me next time and let's dive into Jim Henson's fantasy. In the meantime, you can follow us on Blue Sky, Threads, TikTok, Instagram, and sometimes Twitter. Please contact us at, with any questions or comments or suggestions at fanmail@backlickcinema.com. Please rate and review. I'd really appreciate it. I hadn't gotten a rating or a review in a really long time, so I'd really like it if you would hop over to Apple Podcast or some of the other podcast apps and write a rating or review. And if you're listening on YouTube, then please like or subscribe because it's a big deal over there. And it actually means more to like it and subscribe on YouTube than it does to rate and review on Apple Podcasts. And more importantly, please leave a comment because I really love to hear from you. One last time, if you like this show, then please help us grow by spreading the word about Backlit Cinema, the podcast. Believe me, it matters. I've been Zoe Richardson. Be safe, share a movie from yesteryear with your family, hug your loved ones, and if you're going to be anything, be outstanding.